autumn of 1953, you could walk into a Ford dealer anywhere in Britain and drive away the cheapest new car the country's motor industry had to offer. It had an engine designed in the 1930s. It had a separate body and chassis, a layout that most of its competitors had already abandoned for the more modern monocoque construction. It had a side valve engine, a configuration that the engineering world was in the process of quietly consigning to history. It had mechanical brakes rather than hydraulics. It had a 3-speed gearbox with no synchro mesh on first gear. It had a single windscreen wiper, mounted centrally, serving the driver's half of the screen with the kind of thoroughness you might call aspirational. It cost £391, tax included. The car was the Ford Popular 103e, and the reason it could be offered at that price, at a time when a comparable Morris Minor would cost you roughly £150 more, was precisely because it was already old. Ford had not designed it. They had simply stopped updating it. The Popular was the last survivor of a pre-war design philosophy, a piece of automotive archaeology still wearing dealer plates, sold to a country that needed cheap personal transport badly enough to accept the terms on offer without complaint. What is extraordinary is not that Ford built it. What is extraordinary is how well it sold, how long it lasted, and what it meant to the specific generation of British drivers who bought it. Because for hundreds of thousands of families who had never owned a car before and who could not have afforded the next model up the range, the Popular 103e was not a compromise. It was a door opening. And there is one specific thing about the engineering choices Ford made to keep the price at £391. A decision about what to leave out that tells you everything about who was making these cars and who they believed was buying them. That we will come to, because it is more interesting than it first appears. To understand the Ford Popular 103e, you need to understand that it was not designed as the Popular. It was born as something else, and then when that something else was replaced by a more modern car. If Ford made the decision to keep selling the old version at a lower price rather than retire it. This was not an unusual commercial strategy in the British motor industry of the early post-war years. It was standard practice for a market where the demand for cheap personal transport was running well ahead of the industry's capacity to supply modern machinery at prices ordinary people could reach. The car's origins lie in the Ford Anglia E494A and the Ford Prefect E93A, which were themselves developments of a design that Ford's British operation had been building in various forms since before the war. The fundamental architecture, a separate pressed steel body mounted on a separate ladder frame chassis, a side valve 4-cylinder engine, 3-speed gearbox, mechanical brakes, transverse leaf spring suspension, had been current technology in the early 1930s. By 1945 it was already a mature design. By 1953, when the Popular was announced, it was a historic one. Ford's Dagenham factory had been building versions of this basic car since 1932. And the knowledge of how to build it cheaply and reliably was embedded so deeply in the production process that it represented a genuine commercial asset. Every variation that increased manufacturing cost had been identified and eliminated across 2 decades of continuous production. The tooling was long since amortized, the supply chain was established and optimized, the workforce understood the car at a cellular level. These were not trivial advantages when the objective was a retail price below £400. The more modern car that displaced the Anglia and the Prefect was the Anglia 100e, announced in October of 1953. The 100e was a monocoque design with an overhead valve engine, hydraulic brakes, and modern styling. It was a much better car, and a more expensive one. Ford understood this, and the simultaneous launch was deliberate market segmentation. The 100e for buyers who could afford modernity, the 103e Popular for buyers who could not. The Popular's name carried its own quiet logic. Calling something popular was not an admission of its limitations. It was a statement of democratic intent. £391 in the autumn of 1953 represented approximately 2/3 of the average male annual wage in Britain at that time. It was not in any absolute sense cheap, but in the context of the new car market, where even a modest Morris Minor cost comfortably over £500 and a new Standard 8 was priced similarly, it was a figure that brought car ownership within reach of buyers who had no realistic prospect of affording anything else. What those buyers received for their £391 was a car that worked. Let us be precise about that before we examine what it lacked, because the Popular's engineering case is often caricatured in a way that loses the actual point. The 1172cc side valve engine, a unit whose basic architecture dated to 1932, was in 1953 a piece of machinery that 20 years of production refinement had made extraordinarily well understood. It produced approximately 30 brake horsepower. That figure tells you almost nothing useful without the context that the car weighed in the region of 1,580 pounds, that the roads it would spend its life on rarely encouraged speeds above 50 miles per hour in any sustained way, and that the qualities the engine most needed to deliver, starting reliably in a British winter, pulling without complaint on hills, going a long time between significant mechanical attention, it delivered with a consistency that contemporary owners documented extensively in the correspondence columns of the motoring press. The side valve layout that the more technically sophisticated deplored was for the buyer who serviced the car himself, which in 1953 described a substantial proportion of Popular owners, a configuration of uncommon accessibility. The valves were in the block rather than the head. They were visible and reachable without the kind of dismantling that an overhead valve engine required. A man with basic mechanical competence, a set of feeler gauges, and a Sunday afternoon could maintain the Popular's valve clearances, set the ignition timing, and clean and adjust the carburetor without recourse to a dealer. In 1953, that accessibility was not a technical shortcoming. For a large number of buyers, it was a meaningful practical advantage. A car you could maintain yourself in your own time without a workshop or a specialist was a car that remained affordable beyond the purchase price. That distinction mattered considerably to the people the Popular was built for. The brakes, the gearbox, and the honest assessment. Let's dive in. The mechanical brakes were the component that attracted the most consistent criticism in period press coverage, and fairly so. Hydraulic brakes, standard on the Morris Minor from its introduction in 1948, and on the Austin A30 from 1951, offered more progressive, more consistent, and more powerful retardation than the cable-operated mechanical system the Popular retained. The Popular's brakes were adequate in the technical sense that the car could be stopped from its achievable speeds without causing an accident in normal circumstances. They were not adequate in the sense that they inspired confidence, particularly in the wet. And several contemporary road tests noted this with varying degrees of diplomatic restraint. Motor, in their 1954 road test of the Popular, recorded that the braking performance was the least satisfactory aspect of the car's dynamic behavior. That verdict was honest and accurate, and it sits alongside another honest and accurate observation, that in 1953, the roads that most Popular owners used most of the time were not roads on which the difference between mechanical and hydraulic brakes was likely to produce a crisis. The car was used mostly at moderate speeds on routes its owners knew well, in conditions that experienced drivers managed within the Popular's limitations. The brakes were a real shortcoming. They were not a daily emergency. The 3-speed gearbox, shared with the pre-war Anglia and Prefect, required a certain technique on the shift into first gear. The lack of synchromesh on first was managed in practice by most owners through the simple expedient of engaging first only when the car was stationary. A habit that became second nature to anyone who drove the car regularly, and that those who understood the mechanism accepted as part of the relationship. What the sum of these characteristics produced was a car that rewarded familiarity. The Popular was not a car you drove immediately well. It was a car you learned. The weight of the steering, the feel of the gear change, the particular technique the brakes required. and once learned, it operated within those limits with a reliability that the people who owned one tended to describe as sterling, which, given the price they had paid for it, was exactly the return on investment they needed, an honest car for honest drivers. What Ford decided to leave out: the callback. Here is the detail I mentioned at the beginning. The thing Ford decided to leave out that tells you most about who they believed was buying the Popular and what those buyers needed. The Popular 1C3E was offered in exactly one specification: one engine, one gearbox, one body style, a two-door saloon. A day with no estate, no convertible, and no alternative to the upright black-painted four-seater body that every example produced wore without variation. One color, in the early production run, black. A limited range of colors became available later, but the initial Popular was black because it was the cheapest. Black required the least preparation of the metal and added nothing to the retail price. There were no options, not in the sense that they were limited, in the sense that the concept of a factory option did not apply to the Popular. You could not specify a heater. The Popular was sold without one. You could not specify a radio or a passenger sun visor or a passenger side windscreen wiper or carpets. The floor covering was rubber matting. The instrumentation was a speedometer and nothing else. The horn button was on the dashboard rather than the wheel, a detail reflecting the cost of adding a contact to the steering column. Ford's logic was explicit and entirely coherent on its own terms. Every component that could be removed without making the car inoperable added cost. Every cost that could be eliminated reduced the price. The Popular's price was its entire commercial proposition. In the discipline with which Ford pursued that price, the willingness to sell a car with mechanical brakes in an era of hydraulics, with a side valve engine in an era of overhead valves, without a heater in a country where it was a reasonable human expectation, reflects a clarity of purpose that is almost admirable in its severity. What it also reflects is a specific assessment of who the buyer was. The calculation was not that Popular buyers deserved less, it was that they were making their first entry into car ownership. The purchase price was the only variable that mattered, and they would adapt to whatever the car's limitations were. Because the alternative was not a better car, the alternative was no car at all. The bargain the buyers accepted, and what came next. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is an accurate one. And the Popular's buyers, by and large, understood and accepted the bargain. The correspondence in the motoring press from Popular owners of the period is not the correspondence of people who felt cheated. It is the correspondence of people who owned a car for the first time in their lives and were discovering with evident pleasure what that meant. What that meant for their range of movement, their working week and their family's weekend. The Ford Popular 103E was produced from September of 1953 to September of 1959. 6 years, a production run that speaks well of any car's commercial viability. Total production across the 6 years was approximately 155,000 examples. A figure that represented a meaningful contribution to Ford Dagenham's output across the decade. By the time production ended, the Popular had been comprehensively overtaken by modernity at every point. The car that replaced it, the Popular 100E, was by any measurable criterion the better vehicle. It had hydraulic brakes, it had an overhead valve engine, it had a heater as standard equipment. The transition from the 103E to the 100E was the transition from pre-war thinking to post-war thinking, and it happened with the quiet inevitability of a tide going out. What the 103 left behind was a generation of first-time car owners who had learned to drive on it and maintained it themselves. They trusted it in a way that a first car earns when it does what it promises without drama or expensive surprise. Many of those owners moved on to the 100E, or to the Anglia, or to a Morris or an Austin. They carried forward the mechanical confidence and the habit of ownership that the Popular had given them. The 103E was the car that made everything else possible, because it was available at the moment they needed something. What 391 pounds actually opened? In the classic car market today, the Ford Popular 103e occupies the territory that pre-war derived designs tend to inhabit. Warmly regarded, genuinely historic, and valued for what it represents rather than for what it delivers as a driving experience by contemporary standards. And valued for what it represents rather than for what it delivers as a driving experience by contemporary standards. Surviving examples are relatively uncommon. The Popular was bought and used hard by people for whom it was a working tool rather than an investment, and the survival rate reflects that. A good, honest example in running order that has not been subjected to a cosmetic restoration hiding structural problems is a more useful acquisition than a show-polished car with undisclosed history. A good, honest example in running order that has not been subjected to a cosmetic restoration hiding structural problems is a more useful acquisition than a show-polished car with undisclosed history. The 103e's simplicity makes it genuinely accessible for owners who want to maintain a classic themselves, and that accessibility has earned it a loyal following among enthusiasts who value the mechanical relationship that older cars of this type offer. 391 pounds. A side valve engine designed 20 years before the car was sold. Mechanical brakes, no heater, one windscreen wiper, black paint on every car that left the factory in the first years of production. The Ford Popular 103e was, by the technical standards of 1953, comprehensively obsolete the day it went on sale. Its closest competitors offered better brakes, more modern engines, and a construction philosophy that the industry had identified as correct for a decade before the Popular appeared. Ford knew all of this. The engineers at Dagenham knew it. The motoring press knew it and said so with varying degrees of tact, and none of it mattered as much as 391 pounds. What the Popular story ultimately says is something about the gap between engineering progress and social progress in Britain in the early 1950s. The Popular existed in that gap. It was built for it, priced for it, and stripped of everything that was not essential so that the gap could be crossed by people who were crossing it for the first time. The men who drove to work for the first time rather than cycling. The families who reached the seaside without a train timetable. The couples who discovered that a Sunday afternoon could contain roads and countryside rather than just the neighborhood. These were genuine changes in the texture of ordinary British life, and a car of comprehensively outdated engineering made many of them possible. The Popular 103e did not offer the best version of the open road. It offered the first version. For its buyers, that was enough, and then some. The Popular 103e did not offer the best version of the open road. It offered the first version. For its buyers, that was enough, and then some. Now I want to hear from you. Did your family own a Popular, or did a relative, a neighbor, someone whose car you were aware of before you were old enough to think about cars consciously? Do you remember the smell of the rubber floor mats, the single wiper tracing its arc, the way the engine sounded at the top of second gear? Did you learn to drive in one, or maintain one, or inherit one? Leave it in the comments. This corner of automotive history belongs to the people who lived it, and I would genuinely like to know what they remember. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscription would be appreciated. Direct by Jack, Chrome Kingdom channel. Thank you for watching.